Welcome. My name is Lisa Haller, and I'm an addictions counselor at Mifkashim, which is the outpatient clinic of Retorno. I'm here to discuss the role of shame in preventing people from setting proper boundaries. But first, we need to discuss what proper boundaries are. Boundaries are the ultimate self-care and personal responsibility. A boundary is something we set for ourselves, not for others. When we try to set boundaries for others, what we are really doing is trying to control them. And controlling others does not work. Let me define the word boundary using a parable. Imagine a house with the doorknob on the inside only. This is living dangerously. This person is at the mercy of the world outside. He has no control over who or what enters his home, nor when, how often, nor whether the door, how often they come, nor whether the door is open or closed, locked or unlocked. He feels very unsafe and unprotected, and likely even endangered. This is boundary-less living. Now, imagine a house with the doorknob on the inside. The person living in this house decides. He decides who, what, how many will enter. He decides when. He opens, closes, and locks his door according to what he deems appropriate for himself. He has control over his space, time, and safety to the extent possible. This is what living with healthy boundaries looks like. Boundaries have two steps. Step 1 is a verbal statement of intent. And step 2 is enforcement, or backing up the boundary with an action. Let's start with an example many of us can relate to. A 14-year-old boy wakes up late for school on a regular basis. Mom and the other children are late because they wait for him in the morning. Mom has tried discussing this problem with him. She's pleaded with him, "Please, Moshe, you will get in trouble for being late. The rest of us will be late because of you. You are not being fair to your siblings," and so on and so forth. But is it really Moshe's fault that Mom is late to work and late getting the other kids to school? She could just leave on time, and Moshe would have to find his own way. But this would make Mom feel so uncaring and mean. So she tries to deflect the responsibility of her own decision to be late onto him and avoid taking responsibility for herself. She so badly wants him to change, to become responsible already. She does not want to have to do the hardest thing, which is to stand up to him and say, enough is enough. She is afraid of his reaction. But no amount of begging, yelling, or screaming is working. Mom finally decides it's time to set a boundary. How will that look? Step 1, verbal statement. I will leave at 7:30 in the morning from now on. If you are in the car by 7:30, I will be happy to take you to school. If you are not in the car by 7:30, it will pain me a lot, but I will leave without you. Step 2, enforcement. Mom leaves at 7:30, even if Moshe is not in the car. As unpleasant as it is for both of them, this boundary is essential for their healthy relationship. Because relationships without boundaries are breeding grounds of resentment, fear, blame, and insecurity. Without boundaries, we don't know where we stand or who we are, where we end and someone else begins. Mom resents Moshe deeply for sleeping late. She blames him and guilts him. He feels resented and blamed and unsure. This is not a healthy relationship. Once Mom takes responsibility for herself by setting her boundary, She detaches herself from Moshe with love and returns to him his responsibility for himself. At this point, resentment, blaming, and shaming evaporate, and the healthy, loving relationship is restored. Let me give you 3 examples of boundaries in more complicated relationships, together with the actions required to enforce them. Example number 1. A parent of a drug addict might say, "I'm not willing to allow drugs in my home. I'm giving you the choice between drugs and home. You have until tomorrow to decide." If the adult child chooses drugs, then the action the parent will take would be to demand that the grown child leave by a specific deadline, and may even change the locks if the child does not respect the boundary. Example 2, a parent or spouse may say, "I am not willing to live with your violence or your threats." The action that this parent or spouse will take would be to file a police complaint and get a restraining order. Example 3, the wife of an alcoholic might say, "I will not continue living with your drinking." The action will be that she packs up and moves out. I want to stress here that these are examples. I am not telling anyone which actions must be taken to enforce boundaries. Each person must get the help he needs and find his own boundaries, which are appropriate for himself in his personal situation. I've chosen these examples to illustrate why setting boundaries is so difficult. It's scary stuff. We all hope never to be tested in such a way. This is why codependents stay put and don't set boundaries for themselves. It's just too scary and painful. The main fear is of the unknown. What will happen if I put my foot down? How will he react? Maybe my husband will divorce me. Maybe my daughter will choose drugs and overdose. So what do codependents do instead? They try to save or fix the addict. They try to control the addict. And here we are, back at the misconception that boundaries are for keeping others in line. She is convinced that if she could only stop his drinking and drugging, everything would be fine. The codependent will do everything in her power to rescue and fix the addict, except set a boundary. She will make empty threats, manipulate, guilt, yell, scream, people please, give the silent treatment, perhaps even promise expensive presents. She'll blame herself. She'll blame him. She'll try to be a perfect wife or a better mother. All control tactics. She may actually think she's setting boundaries for him, but in reality, she's controlling. And as we said before, we can't control anyone but ourselves. Controlling others doesn't work. In her obsession with controlling or fixing the addict, she is totally disconnected with herself, her needs, her dreams, her aspirations, and her feelings. She may have even quit her job in order to stay home and take care of him and keep an eye on him. Some fear will accompany the setting of boundaries for most people. But for addicts and codependents, fear is so crippling and overwhelming that it prevents them from setting boundaries. Instead, they busy themselves with control tactics without even realizing it. Again, we ask, why? The answer is shame. Addicts and codependents are shame-based people. What does this mean? And what is the difference between shame and guilt? Guilt has the power to evoke self-change. A person says, I feel guilty. I don't want to do that again. I will apologize and do better next time. He changes. He believes he is worthy of forgiveness and moves on. And most importantly, he forgives himself. A person who is overwhelmed with shame, on the other hand, believes himself to be worthless at his very core. He is hopelessly flawed and defective, and believes himself to be valueless as a person and unworthy of acceptance, forgiveness, and love. He finds his authentic self to be repugnant, hateful, and unacceptable, and he therefore rejects it. Shame is toxic. So what do shame-based people do in order to alleviate the pain of self-rejection? They work extremely hard at developing a new, more acceptable persona, which will afford them good feelings and validation from the outside, as they are incapable of generating it on the inside. They get all of their value and self-worth from others. Which persona will bring good feelings and validation? For one person, the answer will be substance abuse. For another, it will be perfectionism and overachievement. For another, it will be saving others or caretaking. And still for others, the good feelings will come from behavioral addiction, such as gambling or internet addiction. Let's take the example of the alcoholic husband. He may hold down a job and look perfectly normal on the outside. However, behind closed doors, he is an absentee husband and father. He is not present emotionally. He's incapable of having an emotionally intimate relationship with anyone, let alone himself. He may be a violent drunk, and when he's sober, which isn't the case most of the time, he will argue with his wife or brood. He will be depressed and moody. He will be emotionally unreliable and possibly explosive. He's short-tempered, hits and yells at the children. He waits each day for 5 o'clock to roll around so he can finally take a drink. Shame is what has driven him to addiction in the first place. He's looking for good feelings, and he finds them in alcohol. So he drinks, which brings more shame. His behavior toward his wife and children causes him to feel more shame. He may have lost a job or his driver's license due to his drinking. More and more shame. He wants to feel better, so of course, he drinks, and the cycle continues. What about boundaries? Someone who experiences himself as worthless at his core doesn't deserve boundaries. Let's say his teenager is abusing marijuana and behaving disrespectfully toward his parents, and asks to borrow the car to go to a party where there will be drugs. Will his father be able to say no? He's full of shame. How can he say no? Even to his drug-abusing teenager who is planning on driving and using drugs at the same time. His worthless self cannot sustain another hit. He is completely detached from his own feelings and his knowledge of why he hates himself. He rejected his authentic self long ago. And the persona he has taken on seeks approval, outside approval, even from his own child. If he says no, his son will be angry with him and might reject him or leave the house in a huff or react in some other explosive way. And dad is carrying around a huge sack of shame for having not been, let's face it, a father. He can't possibly say no because he is afraid of his son's reaction. He is afraid of the unknown. He has no tools to navigate even the shallow relationships, let alone relationships with his nearest and dearest, from whom he needs validation so desperately. So his answer will be yes, and he thereby enables his son to continue his using and his unacceptable behavior. This enabling brings yet more shame. What about mom, his wife of 20 years? She's stayed through thick and thin. She's tried to fulfill the roles of mother and father. She's raised their children alone, with no partner, emotionally or physically. She does all the shopping, cooking, house cleaning, disciplining, driving and doctor's appointments. She takes the kids to their after-school activities. She does bath time, story time, and bedtime. She attends parent-teacher meetings alone. She pays the bills, and if the utilities get disconnected, she scrambles around trying to find the money to pay them. She may be taking the kids to therapists in an effort to help them heal from this unhealthy family dynamic. She's doing it all, and she's doing it alone. In addition, she covers up for her husband when he doesn't show up to a close friend's wedding. She apologizes and makes excuses when his boss calls to complain that he didn't show up for work yet again. She knows he's hungover, and yet she promises the boss that yes, of course, she will make sure her husband comes on time tomorrow. She's enabling her husband by never allowing him to face the consequences of his behavior. She's very resentful, and she also takes it out on the kids. She yells, screams, pouts, hits, punishes, threatens, all of which give her the illusion of control when her life is so utterly chaotic and out of control, and all of which are also a great source of added shame to her already shame-based existence. She has also rejected her authentic self and tries desperately to claim the perfectionist persona for her very own. She is a doing machine. She does everything, and so amazingly that she's the envy and inspiration of all her friends. They want to be like her. Good feelings? Of course. Everyone praises and admires her. She gets the validation she so desperately craves from her friends, while behind closed doors, she's faced with a glaring contradiction of her less than satisfactory mothering, to say the least. Will she set boundaries for her children? She certainly is incapable of setting them for her husband for 20 years. The answer is no. She's too afraid of her children's reactions. She too is looking for validation, even from her own children. And she too is overcome with shame and undeserving of boundaries. The inability of addicts and codependents to set boundaries is what allows them to enable each other in staying stuck. Similar to a car with 2 steering wheels and 2 drivers. The addict is trying to drive in one direction, and the codependent in the other. They end up stuck together in a small space, fighting while going nowhere. And neither of them is willing to give up the controls. The only way out of this conundrum is to disconnect with love and each drive his own car, and each controls his own behavior and his own choices. Shame is the driving force behind addiction and codependency. Unfortunately, shame-based adults produce shame-based children, and the cycle continues until one of them has the courage to get help and make changes in himself necessary to break the cycle, at which point something new will happen, but we don't know what. The only question is, are we ready to take a chance? Are we willing to experience the discomfort, the fear of the unknown, and the feeling of being out of control, which accompany the setting of firm boundaries? The important thing is to remember that the choice to set personal boundaries, which are the ultimate self-care and personal responsibility, that choice is ours alone. Thank you.